Howard Barton Unruh lived in a world that felt permanently hostile. By 1949, Camden, New Jersey, was a working-class city shaped by post-war tension, industrial decline, and social fatigue. Streets were narrow, houses stood close together, and privacy was minimal. Every argument, every insult, every perceived slight echoed loudly in a mind already under pressure. For Unruh, this environment did not merely irritate him, it consumed him. Unruh was a war veteran, having served in World War II. He returned from combat with discipline, structure, and an expectation that the world would make sense again. It did not. Civilian life offered no clear enemy, no mission, and no order. Instead, it confronted him with frustration, isolation, and constant humiliation, at least as he perceived it. He lived with his mother in a small home on Mickle Street, a quiet residential block that would soon become infamous. Those who knew Unruh describe him as withdrawn, rigid, and increasingly hostile. He was not charismatic. He was not socially adaptable. Conversations felt strained, and his reactions were often disproportionate. He carried resentment like a permanent weight. Neighbors were not just neighbors, they were adversaries in a private war that existed entirely in his mind. What made Unruh particularly dangerous was not chaos, but control. He was methodical, observant, and patient. His military background reinforced habits of planning and precision. While others might lash out impulsively, Unruh internalized every grievance, storing them carefully. Each perceived insult became evidence in a case he was building against the world around him. Camden authorities had no reason to suspect what was coming. Unruh had no criminal record for violent offenses. He was not under surveillance. He was not considered unstable enough to intervene. Mental health awareness at the time was primitive, especially for veterans. Psychological trauma was minimized, ignored, or misunderstood. Unruh existed in plain sight, invisible to systems designed to prevent catastrophe. In the days leading up to September 6, 1949, Unruh's behavior became more rigid and isolated. He withdrew further, avoiding interaction unless absolutely necessary. His internal narrative intensified. He believed he was surrounded by enemies, shopkeepers who cheated him, neighbors who mocked him, strangers who disrespected him. Reality became secondary to perception. Unruh acquired firearms legally. There was nothing unusual about this in post-war America. Guns were common, normalized, and culturally embedded. What mattered was not possession, but intention. And intention was something no one could see. On Mickle Street, children played outside. Adults went about their routines. The street felt ordinary, safe, predictable. That illusion would not survive the morning. Unruh woke up with clarity, not confusion. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. The decision had already been made. This was not an emotional breakdown. It was the execution of a plan he believed was justified. He armed himself carefully, selecting weapons and ammunition with the precision of a soldier preparing for combat. When he stepped outside his home, the street did not recognize him as a threat. There were no alarms, no warnings, no barriers. The quiet of the neighborhood remained intact for only a few more seconds. The massacre that followed would last approximately 12 minutes. In that time, 13 people would be killed. The street would be transformed into a corridor of death. And American history would quietly cross a line it would never fully step back from. Howard Unruh was about to introduce the nation to a new kind of violence, personal, targeted, and public. Not born from chaos, but from calculation. September 6, 1949, began like any other late summer morning in Camden, New Jersey. The neighborhood around Mickle Street was awake but unguarded, wrapped in routine and false familiarity. People stepped outside to buy groceries, children moved between houses, and shop doors opened without caution. There was no warning embedded in the air, no visible sign that violence was about to rupture the ordinary rhythm of the street. The danger was already present, walking quietly among them. Howard Unruh exited his home armed and prepared. He did not rush. He did not stumble. His movements were deliberate, measured, and purposeful. The weapons he carried were not symbolic, they were functional tools selected for efficiency. This was not an emotional outburst. It was an operation. He moved with the clarity of someone who had already decided how the day would end. The first shots shattered the illusion of safety instantly. The sound of gunfire cut through the street with unnatural force, transforming confusion into panic within seconds. People froze, uncertain whether what they were hearing was real. That hesitation proved fatal. Unruh fired with accuracy, targeting individuals he believed had wronged him. The violence was personal in motive but indiscriminate in effect. Mickle Street became a corridor of terror. Windows shattered. Storefronts erupted into chaos. Civilians attempted to flee but found themselves trapped by proximity and disbelief. The narrowness of the street offered little escape. Each step forward exposed another target. Unruh advanced steadily, firing repeatedly, reloading without urgency, maintaining control over the environment he was destroying. The killings occurred in rapid succession. Victims fell where they stood, on sidewalks, inside shops, near doorways. Some attempted to hide. Others tried to run. None were prepared for the precision and resolve of the attack. The absence of immediate law enforcement presence allowed the massacre to unfold uninterrupted. For 12 minutes, there was no resistance capable of stopping him. Unruh did not fire wildly. His actions were calculated. Each shot served a purpose in his distorted logic. He moved from target to target, crossing the street, entering businesses, and continuing without hesitation. The proximity of the victims amplified the brutality. This was not distant violence. It was intimate, unavoidable, and absolute. Neighbors who survived would later describe the scene as unreal. The transformation from quiet street to killing ground happened so fast that comprehension lagged behind reality. Bodies lay motionless as smoke lingered in the air. The sound of sirens approached too slowly to matter for those already dead. By the time law enforcement began to respond, the damage was irreversible. Officers arriving at the scene encountered devastation rather than confrontation. The street was filled with casualties, shattered glass, and stunned survivors. The shooter had already withdrawn into a fortified position, retreating into his home as the perimeter closed around Mickle Street. The massacre ended not with intervention, but with exhaustion of opportunity. Unruh had achieved what he believed was justice. 13 people were dead. Several others were wounded. The street was silent again, but the silence was different now, heavy, unnatural, permanent. Police surrounded the house, aware that the shooter remained inside. The threat had not yet been neutralized, but the worst had already occurred. The realization settled in quickly. This was not a robbery gone wrong, not a spontaneous fight, not an accident. This was something else entirely. Inside his home, Unruh waited. He had not fled. He had not attempted escape. His objective was never survival. The massacre was not a means to an end, it was the end itself. The world he believed had wronged him had been punished, at least in his mind. The 12 minutes on Mickle Street would echo far beyond Camden. They marked one of the first instances of what would later be recognized as a modern mass shooting. Not a riot. Not a gang conflict. A single individual, acting alone, unleashing targeted violence on a civilian population. The street would never return to normal. Houses would be repaired. Businesses would reopen. But the memory embedded itself into the geography. Every doorway, every sidewalk, every storefront became a reminder of how quickly order could collapse. Howard Unruh had crossed a line that American society had not yet fully understood. The consequences would follow, not just for Camden, but for the entire country. When the gunfire on Mickle Street finally stopped, the violence did not end, it changed form. The street fell into an unnatural stillness, broken only by the distant approach of sirens and the low sounds of injured survivors. Howard Unruh had retreated into his home, the same small house he shared with his mother, transforming it from a domestic space into a final stronghold. Inside, he was armed, composed, and waiting. Law enforcement arrived to a scene unlike anything Camden had ever experienced. Officers encountered bodies where moments earlier there had been ordinary life. The scale of the killing was immediately apparent. 13 civilians lay dead, victims of a single individual acting alone. This was not a riot or a gang clash. It was a deliberate massacre carried out with military precision. Police quickly identified Unruh's residence as the origin point of the attack. The house became the focal point of fear and urgency. Officers established a perimeter, evacuating nearby residents and sealing off Mickle Street. Yet despite the growing police presence, there was no immediate plan for confrontation. Law enforcement in 1949 had no established protocols for dealing with a barricaded mass shooter. The situation was unprecedented. Unruh remained inside, armed and alert. He had ammunition. He had cover. He had already demonstrated his willingness to kill without hesitation. Any attempt to storm the house risked additional casualties. The police were forced into a defensive posture, buying time while attempting to assess the situation. The imbalance of preparation was obvious. The shooter had planned. The response had not. News of the massacre spread rapidly. Reporters arrived, crowding the edges of the police perimeter. Residents stood in shock, watching their street become a crime scene. The realization that one man had done this, without accomplices, without warning, began to sink in. Fear replaced disbelief. Inside the house, Unruh's mental state remained rigid and controlled. There was no evidence of panic or regret. He had not attempted suicide. He had not attempted escape. His actions suggested that he believed his mission was complete. The house was no longer a refuge. It was a waiting room. Eventually, law enforcement made contact. The standoff ended not with a violent assault, but with surrender. Unruh was taken into custody alive. There was no final shootout, no dramatic ending. The killing had already occurred. What remained was containment. As Unruh was removed from the house, the magnitude of the event became undeniable. Officers searched the residence and recovered multiple firearms and ammunition. The volume alone confirmed that the massacre had not been improvised. It had been prepared. The arrest did not bring relief. It brought questions. Who was this man? How had this been allowed to happen? Why had there been no warning? Camden officials struggled to respond publicly. There were no clear answers, only the undeniable fact that a quiet neighborhood had been transformed into a killing field in less than 15 minutes. Medical personnel continued to work the scene, tending to the wounded and confirming deaths. Survivors were escorted away, some in shock, others injured, all permanently changed. The physical damage could be repaired. The psychological damage would not be. Unruh was transported under heavy guard. His demeanor remained calm. There was no visible breakdown, no emotional collapse. The absence of visible remorse disturbed those who witnessed it. This was not rage burning itself out. This was conviction. The siege of the house ended, but the siege on the city's sense of safety had only begun. Camden would never again view violence as something distant or contained. The idea that danger could emerge from within, from a neighbor, from a familiar face, became unavoidable. The arrest marked the transition from immediate crisis to long-term reckoning. Investigators began piecing together Unruh's background, his grievances, his mental state. Each detail revealed not a sudden snap, but a slow accumulation of resentment and isolation. The massacre was not an accident. It was a conclusion. Howard Unruh had been stopped, but the damage he inflicted could not be undone. The street remained sealed. The bodies were removed. The house stood silent. And the city faced a truth it was not prepared to confront. The threat had not come from outside. It had come from within. With Howard Unruh in custody, the immediate violence ended, but a far more complex and unsettling process began. Investigators moved quickly to reconstruct the massacre, documenting the sequence of events minute by minute. Ballistics reports, witness statements, and physical evidence were gathered across Mickle Street and the surrounding blocks. The crime scene revealed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The killings were deliberate, targeted, and executed with discipline. This was not random chaos. It was intent made visible. As authorities examined Unruh's background, a portrait emerged that conflicted sharply with public expectations. He was not a drifter or a career criminal. He was a decorated World War II veteran, trained in firearms, and previously regarded as law-abiding. This contradiction unsettled the public. The idea that a man with no prior violent record could carry out such a massacre challenged assumptions about who posed a threat and how danger should be identified. Psychiatric evaluations began almost immediately. Doctors and specialists attempted to determine whether Unruh understood the nature of his actions. Early assessments described a rigid, paranoid mindset characterized by deep resentment and perceived persecution. He believed neighbors had insulted, cheated, or conspired against him. These beliefs were not fleeting thoughts, they were fixed convictions that shaped his worldview. The massacre, in his mind, was a response to accumulated injustice. The concept of mental illness in 1949 was poorly understood, particularly for combat veterans. Psychological trauma from the war was often minimized or misinterpreted as weakness. There were no comprehensive systems in place to monitor or treat veterans struggling with reintegration. Unruh's grievances had festered in isolation, untreated and unchallenged, until they became justification for violence. As the investigation progressed, public reaction intensified. Newspapers across the country ran headlines describing the killings as unprecedented. The term mass shooting was not yet part of common language, but the phenomenon was unmistakable. Editorials questioned gun access, mental health oversight, and the lack of warning signs. Others focused on moral decay and societal responsibility. There was no consensus, only fear and confusion. The legal process unfolded against this backdrop of national shock. Unruh was charged with multiple counts of murder, and the scale of the case overwhelmed the local judicial system. Courtrooms struggled to accommodate the public interest. Survivors and families of the victims demanded accountability. Yet as psychiatric findings accumulated, the case took a different turn. Doctors concluded that Unruh was legally insane, incapable of understanding the moral weight of his actions at the time of the killings. This conclusion provoked outrage. To many, insanity felt like an evasion rather than an explanation. The idea that a man who had methodically killed 13 people could avoid traditional punishment unsettled the public. Others argued that the diagnosis revealed a deeper failure, not of justice, but of prevention. The debate exposed the limitations of a system unprepared for crimes of this nature. Unruh was committed to a psychiatric institution rather than sentenced to prison. He would spend the remainder of his life confined, removed from society but alive. For the families of the victims, this outcome offered little comfort. There would be no execution, no public reckoning proportional to the loss they had suffered. Justice, as they understood it, felt incomplete. Meanwhile, Camden grappled with its identity. Mickle Street became synonymous with horror. Residents moved away. Properties lost value. The community fractured under the weight of association. Memorials were informal and scattered, reflecting a society unsure how to process a tragedy without precedent. Nationally, the case entered criminological literature. Scholars analyzed Unruh as an early example of a lone wolf mass killer. Patterns were identified: isolation, fixation on grievances, military training, and access to firearms. These insights would later inform research, but at the time, they remained largely academic, offering little immediate protection against future violence. The media continued to revisit the story, framing it as both anomaly and warning. Some portrayed Unruh as an aberration, a singular monster. Others saw him as a symptom of larger systemic neglect. The tension between these narratives reflected a deeper discomfort with acknowledging how ordinary such violence could become. By the end of the investigation and legal proceedings, one truth was undeniable: America had crossed into unfamiliar territory. The Camden Massacre shattered the illusion that mass violence required organized groups or external threats. It demonstrated that a single individual, armed and motivated, could devastate a community in minutes. Howard Unruh was removed from public life, but the questions he left behind remained unresolved. How many warning signs had been missed? How many similar individuals existed unnoticed? And how could a society built on routine and trust protect itself from violence born quietly within its own neighborhoods? The answers were unclear. What was clear was that the massacre on Mickle Street had altered the national conversation forever. Violence of this kind could no longer be dismissed as unthinkable. It had happened, and it would happen again. Howard Unruh did not die on Mickle Street. He did not fall under police fire, nor did he face execution. Instead, he disappeared into the margins of society, confined to a psychiatric institution where he would spend the rest of his life. Yet removing him from the streets did not erase what he had done. His actions had already escaped confinement. They entered history. Unruh lived for decades after the massacre, silent and largely forgotten by the public. He did not express remorse in a way that satisfied the families of the victims. He did not recant his beliefs. His worldview remained rigid, locked in the same grievances that had driven him to violence. The institution contained his body, but it could not contain the consequences of his actions. Mickle Street was rebuilt, but not restored. The physical damage was repaired quickly. The psychological damage was permanent. Survivors carried invisible wounds that shaped the rest of their lives. Families of the dead learned to live with absence, not closure. The massacre had no heroic ending, no resolution that balanced the loss. It ended the way it began, abruptly, senselessly, and without mercy. For law enforcement, the case became a reference point, not because of tactical brilliance or decisive response, but because of failure and surprise. The Camden Massacre revealed how unprepared institutions were for violence driven by a single individual. There were no warning systems, no behavioral threat assessments, no crisis intervention frameworks. Everything that would later be discussed in relation to mass violence was absent in 1949. Criminologists would later identify Howard Unruh as a prototype, not a copycat, but an origin. The structure of his attack, personal grievances, lone execution, public space, rapid escalation, would appear again and again in future decades. Different weapons, different locations, the same underlying pattern. His massacre was not an anomaly. It was a beginning. America did not immediately recognize this. In the years following the killings, the event was treated as a horrifying exception rather than a warning. The language to describe it did not yet exist. The tools to prevent it were undeveloped. The cultural understanding of such violence lagged behind its reality. As a result, the lessons of Mickle Street remained largely theoretical. Howard Unruh did not inspire change in policy or law on a meaningful scale. Gun access remained largely unchanged. Mental health intervention remained fragmented. Veterans continued to return from war with untreated trauma. The conditions that had produced the massacre were left intact. History recorded the event, but society did not act on it. Over time, newer tragedies eclipsed Camden in public memory. Larger numbers, broader media coverage, more dramatic visuals. Yet every modern mass shooting carries traces of Unruh's actions. He demonstrated how little time is required to inflict irreversible harm. He proved that violence does not need ideology, organization, or spectacle. It needs only access, intention, and opportunity. Unruh's life ended quietly in institutional confinement, far from Mickle Street. There were no crowds, no cameras, no reckoning equal to the damage he caused. His death closed a biological chapter, not a historical one. The real legacy of his actions lives on in statistics, case studies, and memorials to later victims whose killers followed the same path. The most unsettling truth of the Camden Massacre is not the number of dead, but how ordinary everything else was. There was no manifesto distributed beforehand, no dramatic announcement, no warning to flee. The violence emerged from routine, from familiarity, from a man known to his neighbors. That ordinariness is what makes the event impossible to forget. Howard Unruh did not invent violence, but he introduced America to a specific, devastating form of it, personalized mass murder in a civilian space. The country would spend the next century struggling to understand and contain what he revealed. The massacre on Mickle Street lasted 12 minutes. Its shadow has lasted generations.